Good evening, and welcome to the 74th season of the Amos Fortune Forum, normally held in person on Friday nights in the Meeting House in Jaffrey Center, New Hampshire, but for this year on the internet instead. I am Cassius Webb, your moderator for this evening. First, a practical note. You're here through the Amos Fortune Forum website, having clicked on either the Facebook or the YouTube button. If you wish to ask a question of the speaker, you will type it in the chat or comments column on the right of your screen. If you do not have an account with the particular website you selected, you may wish to register there now if you think you may have a question in the course of the hour. Questions submitted will be read by me at the end of the main presentation and as time allows. We're privileged to have as our speaker tonight someone who spent his childhood in Jaffrey Center, living a stone's throw from the meeting house where these presentations are usually given, but someone who has devoted almost 30 years to the practice of environmental law. He is currently Vice President of Clean Energy and Climate Change at the Conservation Law Foundation, which we have to thank for reining in many bad environmental decisions in New England and elsewhere. It is my honor to present Greg Cunningham with a view on the front line of the climate crisis. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Cassius, and thank you to the board of the Amos Fortune Forum. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I appreciate the invitation. I do regret that we are remote and that I'm not standing in the meeting house with you all. As Cassius alluded to, the meeting house is a place near and dear to my heart, having grown up falling asleep to the sound of the bell tower and awakening to it. I also, along with my brothers before me, was a caretaker in the meeting house. And so I sat through many an Amos Fortune Forum, sitting in the caretaker's chair in the corner of the room. My wife Ann and I were also married there. So along with Jaffrey Center, Meeting House is near and dear to me, as is the Amos Fortune Forum. So it's a pleasure to be here. As Cassius mentioned, I am an attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation. Conservation Law Foundation is a nonprofit environmental advocacy group. We have offices and advocates in all of the New England states, and we're engaged on the state, local, and federal level. I am the lead for what we refer to as our clean energy and climate change team, and I oversee 16 lawyers who are deployed throughout New England with a charge, in essence, of ensuring that the New England states meet the scientifically dictated emission reduction targets so that we avoid the worst impacts of climate change. That has us before state legislatures. It has us often at utility commissions. It has us before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is like the utility commission on the federal level. And in various other contexts in front of particularly state agencies, trying to both push for an advance clean energy and climate change beneficial policy, and to avoid those projects, policies, laws that will worsen those impacts. So few topics are layered with the complexities to the same extent as climate change. Setting aside for the moment that it is a global crisis that threatens to alter our planet and the lives of generations to come, it is highly personal. We are all contributing to climate change after all. And yet, when you're one of about 8 billion contributors on the planet, it can seem futile and inconsequential to do one's part. Its cause and effects are steeped in complicated scientific disciplines: climatology, meteorology, chemistry, physics. And its potential solutions are, in some respects, by definition, futuristic. It is disruptive in that solutions necessarily mean change. Change presents risks, and risk can cause paralysis. It is, sadly, fraught with political implications and baggage. Perhaps more than anything, it's perceived to be a problem of the future, allowing action today to be forestalled. Let me reassure you that I am not going to get into those complexities to the extent that I can avoid them tonight. Rather, I'd like to focus on a local, that is local to New England, local to you, local to me issue, and try to elucidate for you some sense for what it's like to be a climate advocate, some of the strategies that we use, and to give you a sense for where we are in the fight against climate change and where we're headed. Between 2019 and 2021, that is essentially in the last 18 months, 4 New England states have passed major climate laws, comprehensive climate laws that are really unlike anything that they previously had enacted. And this is after literally decades of pursuit of better, even incrementally better climate policy in all of our states. And even in the midst of a pandemic, we had 2 of our states' legislatures meeting and enacting these, expansive and some would say controversial, but very responsible pieces of legislation. And what I want to explore tonight is how we got there. There are a number of factors that contributed to that ultimate result. But I'd like to explore a few of them, and I would suggest, and I will in this presentation, that at least one major contributing factor was a lawsuit that we at the Conservation Law Foundation with several of our partners brought in Massachusetts, seeking to force action by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. That was back in 2014. And I'll talk us through what the implications of that lawsuit and the decision that ultimately was rendered, what the implications were then and what they, I think, are today. So what are some of the other critical factors? Absolutely the mainstreaming of climate change, and I'll talk about the implications of the media in affecting our approach to climate change. Similarly, I'll share with you some of the shifts in public opinion over the last several years that I would attribute in many respects to the media and exposure and education. And in addition, however, are the really stark scientific realities that have come out in the last 3 years that I think have both caught the attention of the public, but also shaken our policymakers to a certain extent, such that they are now recognizing that the cost of inaction is far more expensive than, in so many respects, not simply monetarily, than action today. So climate change is everywhere in the media. As this slide suggests, it is almost always bad news, and it is frequently, particularly these days, aligning with predictions that were made 10, 20, 30 years ago as to where we might be today if we didn't address climate change. We have seen recently the flooding in Germany, the fires that have wrought the West over the last several summers, but that are in Oregon right now. We can harken back to the blackouts in Texas that were weather related, and increasingly we are able to make the connection between weather and climate change. Obviously, not every storm, not every event is climate change related, but there are trends, and I think all of us are seeing them and feeling them, and they are becoming more real because we're experiencing them ourselves. So as a result, on a daily basis, whether it's through feeds on one's cell phone or the print media, we're all being exposed to climate change on a regular basis. Similarly, climate change is visible very much at home, in our backyards, whether it's an extension of the range of ticks, or our depletion of the moose population as a result of a massive tick population that many believe is climate related, or impacts on various of our industries. The blueberry industry here in Maine, where I'm sitting, has been impacted. The maple syrup industry in New Hampshire and Vermont has been affected. Virtually all of agriculture has been impacted in that the seasons are unpredictable year to year, and the growing seasons therefore have to adjust. We have seen significant public health implications with the incidence of asthma rising, with the effect of heat having really devastating effects on those who are the most vulnerable. And so we not only read about it, we're living it. We're seeing our natural resources impacted. Puffins, for example, who are unfortunately parent puffins feeding their young menhaden, which have migrated north and which they mistake for a much smaller bait fish. When they feed it to their young, it chokes them because they can't accommodate the width of that size bait fish. That's just one anecdotal reference, but there are many. The line that demarcates our deciduous and coniferous forests is shifting northward. That's going to affect our timber industries. The fisheries, our marine fisheries, are migrating northward, in some instances to a beneficial impact, in most instances at a loss to fishermen who can no longer pursue certain stocks. So we are experiencing every day, and that in turn affects our perspective. So some recent public polling reflects the perspective, at least broadly, among Americans, and I'll just walk through these quickly. 7 in 10 Americans now think that global warming is happening. That's a 13% increase in the last 10 years. 67% are at least somewhat worried about global warming. That's an increase of 15% in the last 10 years. The majority, 57%, think it's mostly human caused. Again, an 11% increase in 10 years. Now that 57% is compromised by this asterisk fact beneath it, which is that the poll found that only 1 in 5 of those surveyed understand that more than 90% of climate scientists have concluded that human-caused global warming is happening. So if there were a greater understanding that the vast majority of our scientists not only believe in climate change, but believe that we are causing it through our behaviors, certainly that would influence that 57%. So public opinion certainly is impacting our ability to advance public policy and to really strengthen our legislators and give them justification for action. And that's in part what we've seen in the last couple of years. Similarly, the status of science and climate science, the vast majority of governments and many other entities rely principally for their climate science on what is known as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sometimes referred to as the IPCC. The IPCC is a body of the United Nations, and all 196 international governments are involved in it. They contribute their scientists, policymakers, economists, and deep thinkers to the mission of providing information, study, research on climate change. They generate reports and various technical and policy guidance. One of the most critical of those are the every 6 or 7 year or so massive and highly comprehensive assessment reports that they have been issuing since 1990. The next of these, the 6th assessment report, is actually coming out, the first of them next month, and over the subsequent months in 2022, into 2022. So these assessment reports really give us a broad sense of not only where we are with climate change, what have the impacts been, what can we anticipate them to be, what are some of the actions that we can take to forestall, if not avoid, the impacts of climate change. And they're heavily relied upon, particularly in the context of international climate negotiations. The Paris Climate Agreement, with which some of you may be familiar, is an agreement among all but 2 of the nations in the world, in which the countries committed to, in a non-binding way, committed to reduce their emissions to certain levels. Those negotiations were controversial because, as you might expect, the commitments varied from country to country, and the targets that the countries were choosing varied, in part because, to the extent that a country is aiming at avoiding less warming, it is less costly, it's less onerous, and requires less action. So what most of the countries were aiming for was to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius by the year 2100. The vast majority of countries exceeded that and are more in the 2.5 to 3 degree warming. So fairly well over the target. After the climate negotiations were concluded and the agreement reached, the IPCC requested that its scientists go back and compare what the difference is between achieving a limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees Celsius. And the outcome of that report, which is known as the global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, is really stark. Um, for one, the understanding already by governments and policymakers that they would have to reduce emissions by, and the estimate for 2 degrees was reducing it by 80% by the year 2050. And by the year 2030, that number could be somewhere in the range of 30 to 35%. That already was onerous and for many felt to be difficult to achieve, if not unachievable. But to have that target shifted, and not only shifted because the 2030 reductions are so critical. It's so critical in the early stages to avoid some of the impacts that are particularly irreversible, as well as some of the costs that are most difficult to incur. So in addition to the 45% by 2030, what the report found was that we should reach a net zero by 2050. Now, what does net zero mean? In essence, they are saying that to the extent that you only reduce your emissions by 80% by 2050, the remaining 20% that continue to be emitted, you have to dispose of, shall I say, in some form or other. And that disposal has to take place either through natural means, like sequestering it in trees, in various plants, in soils, all of which are very feasible and very doable through conservation, enforceable conservation measures, or to the extent that what we have conserved and what we are sequestering naturally is inadequate, through some man-made measures. Those are expensive, untested, and they look something like this. Allowing a natural gas power plant to continue to operate and spew carbon into the air. I'm sorry, not into the air, and to continue to spew carbon, but to capture that carbon and in most instances pipe it to a location where it would be stored permanently. Most of that storage is in geological formations. Geological formations are sealed off, and over time, the CO2 breaks down. So it's futuristic indeed, costly indeed, and untested, but a possibility and something that our governments are looking very closely at. Another option is to actually draw CO2 out of the air, to have facilities that are sucking up CO2 out of the air and similarly piping it to a location where they're stored. So that's what net zero looks like. It's somewhat daunting, admittedly, but that's the nature of this 2018 IPCC report. And it's as a result of the daunting nature of it that I think it caught a lot of people's attention. It got a lot of press at the time. And those who are trying to make the decisions around what the next steps are with climate change, I think paid particular attention, including legislators. So very quickly, and I hope that this is visible on your screen, I just want to run through what the report found that the difference in a 0.5 degree of warming makes. So the exposure of the percentage of the global population that would be exposed to severe heat waves is 2.5 times greater under a 2% versus a 1.5%. The decline in the annual catch of marine fisheries, the decline is 2 times worse under 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees. Species loss, 2 times worse. Decline in coral reefs, up to 29% worse. So it's a parade of horribles in many respects. And consequently, virtually all governments have latched onto, as they should, this target of 1.5 degrees Celsius to limit our warming to that. So that gets me to the next critical factor, which is this suit that we brought against the Maine Department of Environmental Protection back in 2014. And it really was a turning point then and spawned advocacy that we were central to at the Conservation Law Foundation and that we think has made a big difference in climate policy in the region. So what was the context of Kane? And I'll go into Kane and give you a little more detail on what the case was and how it played out. But the context and why Kane was critical is that there wasn't then, as there isn't now, a comprehensive federal climate policy. We have, under the best of circumstances, which really was the Obama administration, had a patchwork of policies, not a comprehensive policy, not a comprehensive, whether it's a carbon price or some other approach that is systematically driving down our emissions or creating incentives to do so. Our states, back in 2008, when the Bush administration was doing nothing about climate change, I think all of them, New Hampshire may not have, but they all have on the books climate aspiration laws that in essence said, we hope to achieve these goals. And most of them are 80% by 2050 reductions, but they don't have any mandate. They don't have any enforceability. And as you might expect with a law like that, they have really sat there on the books and done virtually nothing. Consequently, we've approached climate change on kind of a policy by policy basis, where legislators and policymakers can't look at a package because a package looks too big, it looks too expensive, they just can't justify it. And as a result, the policy by policy approach is tricky as well because they worry that the next policy is redundant of the last policy they passed, that it's additional cost layered onto the prior policy. And so it's a very difficult way of doing business without a plan, without a government-sponsored direction for where we all want to go to deal with this crisis. And similarly, consequently, I think it has advocates and in some respects states in their climate policies being more reactionary than proactive. Now, that's not to say we haven't gotten a lot done, and some of that was reactionary. I mean, we've succeeded in closing all of the coal-fired power plants but one, which is located on the Merrimack River in Bow. And we've avoided big natural gas pipelines sponsored by Kinder Morgan and others into the region, which were critical to avoiding long-lived infrastructure in New England. But at the same time, we don't have the policies that dictate whether those kinds of projects should be proposed in the first place. So one of the state laws differed from the others, and that was the Massachusetts Global Warming Solutions Act. So it was a 2008 enacted law that sets mandatory obligations for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to reduce its emissions 25% by 2020, 80% by 2050. It also requires that the Commonwealth has to promulgate regulations to meet its 2020 target and lays out various other requirements, but for the most part is silent on any kind of enforceability and doesn't give really enough direction to the Commonwealth on what it must do, or that at least was the interpretation of then Governor Deval Patrick. Consequently, between 2008 and 2016, no action was taken by the Commonwealth to promulgate regulations. We brought a rulemaking, as is allowed for under the Department of Environmental Protection rules, and we proposed a set of rules that we felt that the DEP in Massachusetts could promulgate and that might be in compliance with their obligation. That petition was denied, and so we sued the Commonwealth in Superior Court in Massachusetts. Our lawsuit was, we lost the lawsuit, and the Superior Court found, consistent with the arguments of the Attorney General's office, that Massachusetts had in essence complied, that various actions, bizarrely including some that predated the law, and so these were actions on the books, not in reaction to the Global Warming Solutions Act, that those represented compliance with the rulemaking obligation. We decided after much debate to appeal that decision. It's very hard to flip the decision of a superior court. And so we put all of our resources into it. We felt throughout the process that we were not likely to prevail. And that was in part because there were a couple of new members of the court who had been appointed by Governor Baker and who appeared to be fairly conservative, particularly on environmental issues. We prepared my former colleague, Jenny Rushlow, who's now a dean at the Vermont Law School and who argued the case. She prepared assiduously. We prepared her assiduously, brought in Superior Court justices, retired Superior Court justices from Massachusetts, lawyers, worked with the Columbia Law School and the Pace Law School and Suffolk Law School, and with our partners in the climate effort, and prepared Jenny for this argument. It went well, but it appeared that the conservative members were unconvinced. Well, months later, we received a 9-0 decision in our favor that not only confirmed and reaffirmed all of the relief that we were asking for, but it interpreted into the Global Warming Solutions Act actions that even we in our zealots of the environment way could read into it. And it's really a work of art. This is Kane versus the Department of Environmental Protection. I would recommend it to you. Only a few of you will probably fully appreciate it, but it really called out the Commonwealth for its failure to meet its obligations, and it scolded them for really dropping the ball on a crisis as critical as this is to all of us. So that then led us, or I should say that led the Baker administration to immediately initiate a rulemaking within 9 months, one of the fastest rulemaking processes I'm aware of in the Commonwealth. The first real climate rules were in place in Massachusetts, one of which requires power plants in Massachusetts to reduce their emissions by 3% every year until the year 2050, at which point they're at 80% of what they were when the rules were first promulgated. So really cutting edge stuff and critical to all of our advocacy in this area. So we received that decision in 2016. In 2017, the new administration took over, now the former administration, and with some pomp and circumstance immediately pulled out of the Paris Agreement and then began to systematically roll back our climate laws, really the few that we had on the books at the federal level. It became very clear to us in the climate advocacy movement that our focus needed to be, and all of our resources, entirely directed at the states. So we at CLF initiated what we refer to as our New England for Paris campaign. We were going to implement Paris in New England, and with a goal of having four of the New England states that at that point did not have an enforceable climate law. Connecticut did have a climate law. It's that I think, at least by our interpretation, is enforceable. But 4 other New England states did not, and our goal was to pass laws in those states. So we did not succeed in several of those states for a couple of different legislative sessions, and ultimately, as I referred to earlier, in 2019, Maine passed its climate law, and then Vermont and Rhode Island followed, and Massachusetts, lastly, upgraded to a Global Warming Solutions Act 2.0, a really fine piece of legislation that's immensely comprehensive and really complementary to lots of other policies, and that includes environmental justice components and an equity element that has us looking at the cumulative impacts on those people and those neighborhoods and those communities that have borne the greatest brunt of pollution and climate impact over time, and who are most at risk, and ensures that we analyze and attempt to avoid those additional impacts while trying to benefit those communities. So what are the critical elements of these state laws, and what makes them so important and groundbreaking, and why is this good news in the midst of all of the climate bad news? Well, first and foremost, they all contain mandates. They are all consistent with the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change Science, all with either net zero in the law, or the governor has issued an executive order that requires net zero. They all have a climate plan requirement, which is that essentially the state must put on paper and map out how they will achieve the next required increment of reduction. So in this instance, in most states, their climate plans will be reflecting what they will do to meet the 45% reduction by 2030. And not only are they engaging in that planning, but there is a fair amount of modeling and what we refer to as road mapping for how you get there, analyzing different scenarios, testing theories on different forms of technology, whether you're emphasizing offshore wind here or suggesting that nuclear would be the solution here, testing each of those hypotheses to see what the costs look like, what the reductions look like, how feasible it is to permit, build, and ultimately operate those different technologies. So these climate plans are essential, and they give us all a roadmap for where we're going, like it or not. And we can, to the extent we don't, and I'm confident we will each be on different sides of them at different times, it's in writing, it's a public document, and we have the ability to comment on them and try to influence them in the future. Which gets me to the next point, which is that the processes of developing these really were focused on people. First and foremost with the process, where they were designed to bring in and engage stakeholders of all walks, whether the business community, our neighborhood communities, or environmentalists. And the plans are intended to take into consideration, as I alluded to with the Massachusetts legislation, to have an equity component to ensure that nobody is left behind, to ensure that programs don't benefit only certain socioeconomic groups and that they benefit all, and that burdens that have been placed on some groups more heavily over the time, particularly with our transportation and our energy infrastructure, that we not only relieve those burdens, but we further benefit those communities. And then finally, the ever critical enforceability, which I, as a lawyer, find particularly essential to these, but you should as well, because it allows all of us to hold our government accountable. So where do the roadmaps lead? The climate planning and road mapping process has been completed in Maine and has been completed in Massachusetts. It's in the midst of it in Vermont, and Rhode Island has yet to initiate it. So the jury is still out to a certain extent, and the results are somewhat preliminary, but I did want to give you some sense for what that future looks like and what the states that have gone through it thus far seem to be pointing out as their direction. Let me start by showing you a depiction of where the greenhouse gas emissions are principally coming from in New England. And this breakdown is consistent with each of our states is very close to this, and New Hampshire's emissions are almost identical in these proportions. So as you can see here, the electric sector emissions have been fairly significantly reduced over time. That has been the primary focus of climate advocates for the previous 30 years or so. And currently our energy generation mix in this region is about 48% low to no emitting and 52% natural gas, with some other thrown in there as well. The non-emitting includes nuclear, it includes low emitting hydro, and it includes renewables. So the theory that that Massachusetts and Maine at least are operating under is that the best path forward is to decarbonize our electric sector fully to the extent we can, or as close to fully as possible, and then electrify the way in which we move people through transportation, whether it's vehicles, transit, trains, or otherwise. These two categories, commercial and residential, reflect our housing stock and our building stock. So this is about heating and cooling and heating water. And similarly, the theory is we electrify our heating using various technologies, including air source heat pumps, for those of you who are familiar with them, which are units that either sit on the wall or can be embedded in your floors or walls, but that are highly efficient, use very little electricity, and consequently, when you're generating clean electricity, generate virtually no emissions. So this is what Massachusetts is looking at. So this may be a difficult chart for some of you to see, and I apologize for that, but let me try to talk through it. This chart reflects the various sources of electricity in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And this axis reflects the passage of time. So in 2020 here, Massachusetts electricity is largely generated by gas, by imports from Canada and New York and New Brunswick, which are comprised of hydropower and various other resources, and then some solar and some wind. As you see with the passage of time, the gas consumption goes down substantially, and the generation that is fueled by gas goes down substantially. And what takes its place is solar and wind. And in Massachusetts, that is largely offshore wind, as they are investing in Vineyard Wind and other similar large offshore projects. You will also notice that as the process of electrifying transportation and buildings goes on over time, this is the total amount of electricity generation needed in Massachusetts. It expands significantly, and that's one of our challenges. Not only do we need to clean up our electric sector, but that sector will grow substantially, and the infrastructure that has to support it will grow substantially. And we have to both ensure we have the policies in place so that that is done responsibly and with as minimal impact as possible. But we also need to expedite the process so that we have the infrastructure to reduce emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Very quickly on this side, what this reflects is, as it relates to buildings and transportation, electricity over time. Again, this is the amount of energy needed, and this is 2020 to 2050. Electricity is more and more heavily relied upon as we approach 2050. You see that pipeline gas, used largely for heating, but also to some extent for electricity generation, goes down substantially. Gasoline and diesel for vehicles goes down almost to zero. So those are the theories that Massachusetts is operating under in its electrification approach to mitigating climate change. And in Maine, I thought I would share with you some numbers because they're fairly stark. So on the transportation side, the number of what they refer to as light duty EVs, which are cars and small trucks, by 2025, Maine is aspiring to have 41,000 EVs on the road. I think Maine is currently under 10,000, probably well under 10,000. By 2030, 219. By 2050, over 900,000. On the buildings front, they are looking to initially retrofit houses so that houses that currently rely on oil or gas would have a supplemental heat pump, which would avoid some of the consumption of fuels by avoiding some of the time in which a furnace runs. They're hoping to get 80,000 of those in place by 2025 and 130,000 by 2030. Supplementing those are in new homes, whole house heat pump systems so that there is no fossil fuel consuming heating within the home. And so by the time we get to 2050, and as housing stock has turned and renovations have taken place, the hope is the individual heat pump numbers will be less needed, but we're aiming for almost 500,000 whole house heat pump systems. And as you can see, what that renders here at the bottom is the emission reductions from 1990 levels as it relates to the building sector is down by 82% by 2050, and thereby achieving Maine's goal. This does not address the net zero question. So I hope that gives you some sense for not only where we're heading, not only the sophistication of the analysis and the conclusions that are being reached by our governments, but the fact that very significant action is being undertaken and plans for how we undertake this massive effort are underway. And that is what gives me hope in the face of the headlines that I shared at the very beginning of the presentation. So with that, I will stop, and I guess we can see if we have some questions.
Thank you very much, Greg. That is a wonderful sort of synthesis of the general situation as it affects the whole world, and also the specific situation of New England with how the law works into this, how legal thinking and legal action can bring about change. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. A listener asks fairly early on in the discussion, by extreme heat, are we talking, I assume meaning in your forecasts of the future, if we don't take care of this, are we talking about the kind of thing recently experienced in the Northwest US, or are we talking about something even worse?
The short answer is it varies. I would refer you to, there was a piece in the New York Times about and I think they've got a series of heat maps in the story. I think it was on either today's or yesterday's New York Times, reflecting just this, the answer to just this question. And it varies from region to region. As you would expect, sub-Saharan Africa and other areas of the world that can least afford to be burdened with yet another challenge in their lives will be hit the hardest. But it's going to change. I mean, so there will be areas where extreme heat means risking lives and certainly affecting public health. There are other areas where extreme heat means substantial changes in the way we do things, what life is like, what our natural environment looks like, what our built environment has to look like to accommodate those conditions.
Thank you. We also have a question. What are your thoughts on current tax incentives for residential and commercial to be more environmentally focused?
So there are many different forms of tax incentive. I alluded to what's known as a carbon fee or a carbon tax, which is that products or services that are generating carbon would have an additional cost attached to them, which would do two things. It would create a revenue stream that could be used for any number of purposes, but it would also make those products and services more expensive, and perhaps create a disincentive for the carbon intensive and more incentive for the less carbon intensive. The European Union, as you may have read in the news, just instituted a very similar policy in which they are essentially putting an additional charge on imports if based on their carbon intensity. It is, for many, it is the holy grail of climate policy. From my perspective, there are substantial risks. One of them is that getting that cost right is challenging. It's, needless to say, politically unpopular to make any product more expensive or to increase the costs of daily living. And so when politicians are making those kinds of decisions, the potential that they will do the right thing but not go far enough is substantial. And so we may be paying more but not reaping the benefits of those additional costs. That's one significant risk. Another is we're making what for many is already a difficult, costly day-to-day living even more costly. And not all of the carbon tax or other tax formulae have feedback loops that allow for essentially a hold harmless for those who can least afford the additional charges. So getting those factors right is important. There are many in what we refer to as the climate justice or environmental justice movement who would suggest that creating those kinds of incentives just isn't enough. There's too much room for mayhem and manipulation and abuse, that instead we need top-down regulations. This is too important.
Another member of the audience can't help but notice that New Hampshire is conspicuously absent from the discussion of these New England state measures. Is that due to our political climate or something else?
I think it's very much due to your political climate. Governor Sununu has been accused of being a climate denier. I think he has since made comments that remove him from that category, but he's definitely shown a lack of interest in any kind of meaningful action on climate. I mean, there is if folks are familiar with energy efficiency programs, the programs in New Hampshire that provide discounts on energy efficient light bulbs, halogen and such light bulbs, and formerly compact fluorescent light bulbs, as well as providing businesses with more efficient heating and cooling. Those programs are subject to review every 3 years, and your Public Utilities Commission has to approve that program. There has been a final proposal agreed upon by all of the parties involved in the proceeding, pending in front of your New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission for over 6 months now, with no action from the PUC. I can only attribute that to a decision on high that this program, which is the least costly, every dollar invested in this program renders $3 in benefits. It's a no-brainer on virtually everyone's scale. It's a no-brainer. And yet it's not moving in New Hampshire, as with really anything else related to climate change, with one exception, which is offshore wind, which Governor Sununu appears to have an interest in offshore wind, and that's encouraging. And we are encouraging him to pursue it.
Thank you. I'm curious myself. Did you, obviously the combination of law and environmental action, did you yourself, I mean, and this is just sort of as a way of inviting other people's reflections on their own lives, did you decide when you, that you would go to law school in order to become an environmental lawyer, or did you become a lawyer and then decide that this was the field in which you wanted to work?
I decided to become a lawyer. It may not have been precisely in this location, but it was heavily influential on my decision. In Sally Pierce's living room, for those of you who remember Sally Pierce, in the midst of community discussion about the proposed build out of the Shattuck Golf Course and the associated condominiums. And Gregor McGregor was addressing the group. Gregor was a lawyer who had family or in-laws in Jaffrey and is a well-known lawyer in the Boston area. And he was advising the group on how to approach this environmental concern, this community concern. And in listening to him and the strategies that he laid out, it occurred to me that this was a way to make change. At that time, climate change sadly was not on my radar. And it wasn't until I became an environmental lawyer and became more steeped in these matters that I became motivated to move into this area.
Uh-huh. Thank you. That was round one, I believe, of efforts to put condominiums around the golf course. There was another one later, which also involved legal action. I don't have anything else in particular. It seems to me you've dealt a little bit with the fact that the New England states are all different. And if you're going to be dealing legally with them, you have to deal with the particular body of law in each one. But would you say that there are any sort of trends in legal thinking in the last few years that have made the job of an environmental lawyer easier or more difficult?
One of the trends that has made it more difficult is there's this concept of standing in litigation contexts where one can't appeal or question the actions of government or other parties in our courts unless you have appropriate standing. That is, have you been injured? Are you directly affected? And the bar that courts have set for that entry into the courts and that ability to push back or question has been raised substantially over the years, which has really limited particularly individuals' ability to participate, but also organizations. So that's one limitation. I think one example of environmental laws that will help make things easier are laws I've just described in this presentation. Being a global concern and requiring a global effort means multiple political entities will have to come together to resolve, and we won't resolve it, but to deal with it and to mitigate it and to avoid the worst of it. So what New England can pilot or demonstrate in our region, coming together of 6 what at times are vastly different political and otherwise entities and peoples, our ability to pass similar laws that will allow us to ally with one another economically and otherwise, jointly purchase clean energy, for example, which is very much in the thinking of at least 5 of the New England states. It has simplified matters for me as an advocate because it means that these entities may be taking this on and perhaps I can shift my focus elsewhere, or at a minimum, there's the level of coordination that doesn't require us to be herding cats among the states. So it's really positive in that respect as well, that it does, and I hope will, demonstrate the value of coordinated action among our states and other political entities.
Great. Well, I think you said that you were a person of hope at this point, that you did have hope in this field, which is a good thing. And it sounds as though, although it's incremental, the increments are getting shorter in time, and that there has been enough of a dramatic shift in public thinking, however not yet informed, that we really may be getting somewhere in this. I wonder whether COVID might not have had a little bit to do with realigning our thinking.
And I probably should have mentioned it, Cassius. I'm confident that it did, and it's no coincidence, I think, that under the most challenging logistically and otherwise conditions, legislatures in 2 of our states passed really groundbreaking laws and did the right thing.
Right.
And I suspect some of the reflection that we've all experienced during COVID may have played a role in that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you, audience, for a very stimulating hour. Our thanks also to the Forum Committee under the leadership of Nan Bider and Rosemary Putnam, and to Andrea Cornelius, who you don't see, but who has been very, very busy this last hour and in an hour previously in sort of getting the two of us in some condition where we could have this discussion and have it work. Greg, we're delighted, of course, to give you the traditional half gallon of local maple syrup. But you're not here, you're there. So we'll figure something out and you will get your half gallon of maple syrup. Fear not.
Fear not. My sister texted me last night and it apparently has been delivered to my mother's house. So
that's way ahead of me. All right. That's good. Well, they better not consume it all before you get there. That's all I think. Okay. So that's it. Thank you very much for this evening and for all your good work. And the audience, please join us again next Friday evening as we will hear Will Torrey, another local name. Will Torrey will tell us Your Health Matters, Improving Access to High Quality Psychiatric Care. Good night.